Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your hosts, Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson.
Hi, listeners. Today we have a great podcast to share with you with the preeminent liturgical scholar, Dom Alcuin Reid. Dom Alcuin is the founding prior of the Monastère Saint-Benoît in the diocese of Fréjus-Toulon in southern France, and is an organizer of the Sacred Liturgy International Liturgy Conferences. This interview was recorded in the summer of 2019 following the Sacred Music Colloquium of the Church Music Association of America, where Dom Alcuin was a keynote speaker.
Thanks so much for being with us today.
A pleasure.
So we'd like to talk today about the spiritual fruits of obedience and being shaped by the sacred liturgy. I remember in my own life, the first time I read the documents of the Second Vatican Council on the sacred liturgy, I was surprised by what I learned, and I realized that I had so much more to learn. And what reading those documents inspired in me was a desire to be shaped by the sacred liturgy in obedience to the Church. I'm reminded of the scene in the gospel when the disciples ask Jesus, "Lord, teach us how to pray." They come to the Lord and He teaches them the Our Father. He gives them words to repeat and instructs them in the interior disposition they are to have when praying. This is what we do when we allow ourselves to be led by our Mother, the Church, in the act of liturgical worship. Could you comment, especially in your monastic vocation as a Benedictine monk, about the movement of the Lord in our hearts when we allow ourselves to be shaped by the sacred liturgy?
St. Benedict has a lovely line at the end of the prologue of his rule where he speaks of the expansion of our hearts when we, as monks, follow the school of the Lord's service. And a monk, of course, is first and foremost a being who prays, who immerses himself day and night, 7 times during the day, once at night, in the sacred liturgy, and hopefully comes to experience, gradually by that immersion, the expansion of his heart, the closeness to God, the indwelling of God in his heart. And I think for all of us, we don't have to be monks to discover this in the sacred liturgy. If we immerse ourselves in the liturgy, we begin to discover ourselves, we begin to experience that welling up of the heart, the opening of ourselves to God, because we're discovering not something within us, we're discovering something coming to us, or more importantly, we're allowing something to come into us. And that brings us really to the nature of the liturgy, which is our worship of God. And by worshipping God in the liturgy, we discover who we are as baptized sons and daughters of God. We grow as sons and daughters of God, focusing on God and discovering therein who we are, each in our particular vocation, monk, laymen and women, secular clergy and other religious, in all of our different vocations in our life. By immersing ourselves as much as we can, Holy Mother Church teaches us that the minimum is Sunday Mass, but there's much more to the liturgy than that. We discover our vocation as Christians and are empowered to live it.
Could you articulate some fundamental liturgical principles that should shape how the liturgy is celebrated, particularly in terms of music?
Well, again, I think the first thing we have to understand when we come to celebrate the liturgy is what is it? And it's the worship of God. The focus is on God. And if we have that orientation, if we have that direction psychologically in preparing to celebrate the liturgy, then that already tells us what we should be doing. We offer our best to God, as Scripture says, we offer Him our first fruits. So what we're doing is for God, first and foremost, not for us. There's a famous line in Pope Benedict's apostolic exhortation, Sacramentum Caritatis, when he says in respect of music in churches, he says, it has to be said, quite frankly, one song is not as good as another. And in that respect, when we come to the sacred liturgy, what we do musically needs to be the best. We can. Obviously, smaller parishes and communities can't do what cathedrals can do. But so long as it's the best and so long as it's for God, and then similarly so long as what we do in the liturgy is of God. Because the liturgy has its own language, it has its own signs and symbols. We call this more broadly liturgical tradition. There are ways in which our family, our Christian family, the Catholic Church in the Western or Latin Rite, worship. In the past, a large amount of that has been in the Latin language. Since the Second Vatican Council, that's been permitted more and more in the vernacular. But the Latin tradition is still part of our family heritage, and it's a way of worshipping God. Our gestures are of God. The words we sing, the chants we sing, the songs that are employed in the liturgy need to be of God, not of the world, because that's what we're doing. Pope Benedict, in that apostolic exhortation, talked about an ars celebrandi, a way of celebrating the sacred liturgy, which was the fruit of being faithful to that tradition and to the liturgical norms, the directives given to us by the Church, saying that that method, that ars celebrandi, that way of celebrating the liturgy in faithfulness and fruitfulness, has indeed been fruitful for centuries throughout the tradition of the Church. And if we therefore focus on God, if our worship is for God, and if our worship is of God, then those fundamental principles should guide us in the practical choices we make with the resources at our disposal.
You know, I've noticed in working with religious communities that monastics are particularly attuned to those elements in sacred music that are in harmony with the sacred liturgy and those that are out of tune with the sacred liturgy, particularly because they spend all of their liturgical life in the monastery and are shaped by the musical life there. What are some musical things to you that when you notice them as a monk strike you as out of sync or out of harmony with the nature of the liturgy?
Well, I've just had the privilege of spending a week at the Church Music Association of America colloquium, and I've heard a lot of non-monastic music. We don't have much polyphony, and we've had some magnificent and beautifully rendered and beautifully worshipful, if I may use that word, pieces of music sung at splendid liturgical celebrations, which have lifted the minds and hearts to God from different composers of different epochs, different styles of music within the Church's treasury of sacred music. I'm not terribly often in parish churches across the board these days, but even in a very small parish church, one can immediately sense whether what is being sung is lifting up the mind, heart and soul to God, or whether it's something fairly ordinary that's been chosen because perhaps it's music and perhaps it's very easy, but if you look at the content of it in terms of what words are being used, if you look at the musical quality of it in terms of whether or not its genre actually does lift people's minds and hearts to God, it can sometimes seem a little pedestrian, which is why I think if we use those two principles, that what we are doing is for God and what we are doing is of God, and then add to that Pope Benedict's call for us to use an ars celebrandi, which is rich and as fruitful and faithful as it can be, then I think we can judge whether something is appropriate or not.
You know, that reminds me a little bit, speaking of Cardinal Ratzinger, of his use of the term Gebrauchmusik, or like use music, utility music, music that works. And I think this is a lot of times what music directors feel like they can do in a parish. Well, we use this piece of music because it works here. But we're not really evaluating things in terms of the nature of the music according with the nature of the sacred liturgy. And we'll talk a little bit more about Ratzinger's thought about the sacred liturgy, but what are some things you think that people could keep in mind in terms of falling into a sort of liturgical minimalism that encourages the use of this utility type music rather than something that is perhaps still simple and modest, you know, if they're of modest means or, you know, in a small parish with limited training, for example? How do they stay away from a liturgical minimalism that leads them always to this works?
I'm sure there are plenty of musical directors who'd be listening who would never want to be a monk. This monk would never want to be a musical director. They're different jobs, and my job is not to organise what's being sung this weekend or for this particular feast or occasion. And I'm sure that the temptation to say, yeah, this works and we can do it and it won't involve too much is a real one. For monks too, I think we need to examine our consciences and see what little more we can do to make sure that we're not going stale, spiritually stale, that is. We need to put the heart and soul back into the offices we sing. And I think that's possibly, I hesitate to lay down a program for hardworking people who are doing their best out in the trenches, as it were. But if we can do just a little more over a given period of time, depending upon our resources, of course, and so that in 3 months' time we have 1 or 2 new pieces in the repertoire which have expanded our repertoire, enhanced it, and if that development can continue according to available resources, then I think we're moving forward and not getting ourselves into a rut. Minimalism is, as I've said many times, in respect of the entire liturgy, musically, ceremonially, in terms of preaching, in terms of anything, is a cancer to the sacred liturgy, because the liturgy is a feast. Even in its penitential form, or even at a requiem mass, the liturgy is a feast. It's a feast of our salvation. And we're feasting on the mysteries and celebrating those mysteries. So we mustn't get into a rut. And the Church's tradition is very, very rich. Thankfully, there are good vernacular pieces of music available, in this day and age. There is a very rich treasury of chant, which may terrify some people, but to learn a piece of chant, to learn a couple of pieces of chant for a scholar, for a choir, in a given couple of months, may well be possible. The great treasury of polyphonic sacred music is there, and again, yes, it may be daunting, but if we don't dare to do as much as we can in our given situation, then we will get into a rut and we will become minimalists and we'll be bored with our own shadows in the sacred liturgy pretty quickly.
What you're saying reminds me of a couple of instances where I've been invited to work with a community of sisters that is primarily older sisters, sisters that have lived their vocations as nuns for 40, 50, maybe even 60 years. And I've always been so edified by even the invitation to come in and teach them vocal technique or teach them one little bit of new music. To me, that's so edifying. Like, you've been doing this your whole life, praying this music your whole life, and yet you have the spark of love in your heart to help you desire to do something just a little bit more than what you're already doing. And I think that's what you're getting at.
Yeah, I think liturgical life is a life of love. It's not a matter of Sunday morning duty. It's a matter of celebrating God's love for us first and responding to his love with the best we can offer. Sure, that involves effort, but in any relationship there must be effort, and in any relationship there must be expressions of love today. If we don't express that love today, then that love might die tomorrow, and that's really, really important in the liturgy at every level, so that we neither become minimalists and die of the cancer of minimalism, nor that we get into a routine which is just, to use a word sometimes on people's lips when they're at Mass, boring.
What would you recommend for parish musicians or priests who are looking to form themselves more with a proper liturgical formation?
I think liturgical formation comes from living the liturgy, and obviously making that deeper in one's own celebration thereof. But I think it's also really important. Priests are supposed to make a retreat every year. In some of those years, it would be really rather good if they could spend some of that time in a centre, a religious house perhaps, other places where the liturgy is celebrated beautifully, reverently, prayerfully. Monasteries are good for that usually, but there are other places as well. Conferences like the CMAA conference we've been at this week immerse people in a liturgical experience which is enriching. People can take things home, they can see good practice. Similarly, for parish musicians, musical directors and others working with them, I think it's good to look over the garden wall and to experience life somewhere else. Good liturgical life, obviously, exemplary places. And again, if people are able to travel, visiting some of the monastic centres, if people are daunted by the prospect of Gregorian chant, a couple of days in a monastery where it's sung 8 or 9 times a day for several hours is not a bad immersion. It might be daunting, but it can give people an experience which is not normal for them, and give them a taste for something, a vision for something. A parish church won't ever be a monastery in terms of its chant, but there is something of the monastic recollection in liturgy which is very helpful, even in a busy parish on a Sunday morning. I mean, obviously there's practical and professional formation, such as the CMAA likes to provide in its colloquium and other conferences, and professional formation in music, and you know more about that than I do. But I think that in that, again, having talked about becoming stale, we need in all of our professional fields to make sure we refresh ourselves, renew ourselves, and expand our horizons. St. Thomas Aquinas said, as I mentioned earlier, that we should dare to do as much as we can for God in praise of the mysteries. The other thing, too, is I think it's good to step outside the specifically musical remit and to expand our understanding or deepen our understanding of the theology of the liturgy. Now, that doesn't mean that every church musician or music director has to have a degree in theology, but perhaps in Lent it's appropriate to do a little bit of reading, guided reading perhaps, with the help of the clergy or perhaps with the help of outside persons, to understand more of what we're doing in the liturgy and to therefore have a better basis. God the Holy Ghost is intelligent enough, if we have the basis, to inspire us, in directions in which we can move forward in our given situations.
In terms of theological reading, one of the great sources is Ratzinger's The Spirit of the Liturgy. And it seems that there's a new edition of that book out. And if someone wanted to read that book, what are some things that you think they should know about it in order to approach it without getting intimidated or getting the most out of it?
Cardinal Ratzinger's Spirit of the Liturgy was published 20 years ago now, and he published it at the time with a sort of a call for a new movement towards the liturgy in how to celebrate it properly interiorly and exteriorly. And in a sense, that's what he's trying to do there. He's trying to give us a little bit of interiority and also to discuss how we do that exteriorly. He wrote it as he chose the title of it, should I say, directly paralleling a much earlier work by Romano Guardini, The Spirit of the Liturgy, published a little before 1920, which at the beginning of the 20th century tried to do much the same thing. It tried to get people praying the liturgy of the church interiorly and exteriorly more correctly, more fruitfully, more to the point. I mean, that's its intention, and that's why it's a really important thing. And you mentioned that Ignatius Press has brought out a 40th anniversary edition, I think it is, with a preface by Cardinal Sarah, Prefect of the Congregation of Divine Worship. And Cardinal Sarah has underlined that importance of praying the liturgy not simply externally, but praying what is essential and having the engagement of hearts, minds and souls in what we're doing. For a musical director or for church musicians, one doesn't simply want excellent voices or excellent sounds. One wants the excellence of hearts, minds and souls connected. St. Benedict says in his rule that our minds and hearts should be in accordance with what we sing as monks. The same principle is there, I think. Cardinal Ratzinger has in that book a section on the theology of church music, but the entire theology of the liturgy, I think, is relevant. It's a typical Ratzingerian text. It's very precisely written and worthy of study. It's not the sort of thing one reads necessarily in a week. Maybe it needs to be read, over a couple of Lents and pondered. But it certainly is a good source of fundamental theology of liturgy and specifics in terms of ritual and musical practice.
So, playing a little bit on what you were just talking about, this connection between the internal and external, it seems like that's key in making sure that the liturgy doesn't become merely formalistic or artificial. And that's an accusation leveled against people sometimes if they care about the liturgy. Oh, you're just being legalistic and too concerned with external things that don't actually touch upon the heart. So if someone has this experience, like you're talking about, the true accordance of the internal and external in the act of worship in the sacred liturgy, what are some fruits of that? Like, how does someone know that this is an authentic encounter with God, that it's not just formalistic or legalistic. And this devotion of one's attention and time to the liturgy are not just being concerned with things that don't matter. What would you say to someone that is tempted to think that concern for the liturgy is legalistic or formalistic?
I think if you ask the busy mother of a large young family what she does of a morning getting everyone to school or to work, and ask her how much time she has to think about things, how much time she has to sit down and ponder how much she loves her family, the answer is she doesn't have much time to do so. And sometimes, particularly those in liturgical ministry, and particularly musical directors and church musicians or masters of ceremonies or other people, can be in that very same position. They're very, very busy making sure everything's happening. And they don't necessarily have terribly much time at that time to ponder, to contemplate, and so on. I mean, even monks in monasteries can be similarly busy. However, what they're doing is being done out of love, hopefully, not out of the need to obtain a paycheck and so on. And that love is what is so important. That is to say, the motivation needs to be, in the first place, the right motivation. I am busy because I love God, because I want the worship of God to be as perfect as possible, to offer God as much as possible in this given situation. That's why I think the word ministry or service is so appropriate to people in that situation, because it is very much a service. It's a sacrificing, in one sense, of oneself for the sake of others, and that in itself is an act of worship. That said, as Cardinal Sarah warned, it's very important that we don't become activists, and it's very, very important that we have ourselves periods, perhaps before all we have to do, or most certainly afterwards, in which we can interiorize. But the other thing I think we need to be very careful about is not misunderstanding what liturgical prayer is. That is to say, and you asked how does somebody know if this is of God, I mentioned earlier the expansion of heart of which St. Benedict speaks. Liturgical prayer is not usually in words. Liturgical prayer is usually in rites and gestures and postures and sounds. And as many people as there are in a given church at a given time, there are as many different psychologies. And God the Holy Ghost will touch us each in different ways, be that a particular sound, a particular song, a particular piece of music, be that a particular ritual, be that the words of a well-prepared homily, be that incense rising at a given time as prayer. We need to be careful not to become too linear in our idea of what liturgical prayer is, but allow ourselves to be caught up in the rite, allow ourselves to be carried by its rites and symbols, particularly by its music, but also by its rituals, which is again why minimalism is so terrible, because it cuts down the opportunities for us to literally to participate in the liturgical rite.
And really does focus on words.
Yeah, and we're psychological beings who have all various different points of connectivity, and those different points of connectivity are varied, and that's why the liturgy has got so many different symbols. And if we have a pedestrian, wordy liturgy, or if what we're singing this Sunday is the same as what we sang every other Sunday for the last 3 months, it's very difficult for us to connect with what's going on. And what's going on is God is wanting to communicate with us. I mean, the Council teaches us clearly that the liturgy is the place where our Lord lives and acts in the Church today. And our job as liturgical ministers, in whichever way, is to enhance those points of connectivity, to build the bridges over which prayer can march, over which people can be moved towards heaven.
You just spoke about entering into the liturgy and being moved by it. Can you talk about how one can approach the liturgy in a spirit of humility and obedience to it, whether that's from the perspective of the laity or the clergy?
Sure. As I said, the liturgy is Christ acting in the church today. It's about God, it's not about us. Therefore, I'm not the most important person in the liturgy. God is, and I'm there to worship God. The liturgy is, however, not about me, it's about us. That is to say, it's ecclesial. It's about the community of the baptized rendering unto God the worship that is his due. And as any family has rules or ways of doing things, so does our family, the Latin Rite of the Catholic Church. And when I come to worship, I'm not making it up as I go along this Sunday or that next Sunday. We're doing what's in our tradition, what's handed on to us. The liturgy is a treasure handed on to us. And so we approach it in a spirit of humility, to accept the tradition we've received, to pass that tradition on, and to celebrate it as richly as we can in our given circumstances. We have at this time come through some decades in which there have been some poor practice which needs to be left well and truly behind, where people have rearranged the liturgy according to local wishes and so on. That's not what the Church gives us. It's not what we're there to do. We need to receive the liturgy in tradition as the Church gives it to us, and clergy make this promise when they're ordained to ensure that the liturgy is celebrated as the Church hands it on. It's important we respect that. And in that humility, which is not limiting but in fact freeing, we are already, as it were, offering God the gift of that humility.
Beautifully put. For our last question, we're wrapping up. I'm wondering if you can give our listeners a few fundamental principles to keep in mind when they're reading particularly the, say, documents of Vatican II on the Sacred Liturgy. One of the difficulties that can happen with teachings or parts in a document which can seem a little ambiguous is that they might be interpreted different ways from people who have differing liturgical perspectives. So could you give some principles or things to keep in mind for people approaching that, perhaps for the first time or coming back to those documents?
Sure. I think we need to look at those documents in their historical context and realize that it was the intention of the Fathers of the Second Vatican Council to have a moderate reform of the Sacred Liturgy so as to participate the fruitful participation of the faithful in the liturgy. They weren't intending to tear up the liturgical texts and books and draw up new ones or cut them up with scissors and paste and so on. Pope Benedict XVI put the operative principle very beautifully when he spoke about a hermeneutic of continuity, a key of interpretation which says, how can we develop the liturgy, or how can we celebrate the liturgy in continuity with its past, certainly moving forward with some of the advantages of the liturgical reform, but not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, so that any of the bishops who are at the Second Vatican Council who would be at our liturgical celebrations today would be able to say, yes, this is the liturgy of the Church, this is the traditional liturgy of the Church, reformed as the Council wished.
Thank you so much, Dom Alcuin. It's been really great to talk to you today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I hope you've been edified by this episode and that it's given you some food for thought in your understanding of the Sacred Liturgy. If you'd like to recommend a guest for the podcast or suggest a topic for an upcoming episode, send us a message at sacredmusicpodcast@gmail.com.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, SoundCloud, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory's Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole, from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is the first movement of Trio Sonata No. 6 in G major by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Peter Carter. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.